Just briefly introduce each of the panelists here. They can give a 30-second intro of themselves and maybe just a brief comment on what they're seeing in terms of the macro trends in the future of energy for the planet. So first of all, to my immediate right, we have Chris Parry, who is equity guru. He's a financial writer and analyst. Next to his immediate right is Simon Moores, who's the founder CEO of Benchmark Minerals, one of the leading analysts in the world for vanadium, cobalt, lithium, and graphite. And then at the end we have Gianni, who's also a very prolific speaker on the world tour as well, focused on the battery metals, but more importantly, he also brings a really interesting perspective about the role that copper plays in terms of some of the commodities. So, Chris, I'll hand it to you to give a brief introduction and some comments.
Hi, I'm Chris Parry. I set up Equity.Guru, a financial website specifically aimed at bringing the next generation of investors into the investment world. We specifically gear towards younger people who've never invested before, people who think investing is for RSPs. And the reason that we set that up was because cannabis and energy metals seem to be running hot, and we figured that was a great way to get people in who've never really thought about it before. That was 2 years ago. We now have 40 client companies. We have 50,000 unique visitors a month. And I've bumped into a whole bunch of people out here that are under the age of 45, which is a first for a Cambridge House show. Also, a lot of women who are getting into the business for the first time. And in terms of energy metals, I'm looking a little bit longer than some. Cobalt's nice, lithium's nice, but I'm seeing some interesting things with vanadium. Gianni's certainly been on point with copper over the last couple of years. And I want to see what happens not just with the minerals, but with the technology that goes with them.
Yeah, hi, my name's Simon Moores. I'm with Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. We're focused on the lithium-ion supply chain fundamentally. We collect price data for lithium, for graphite, and for cobalt. We do analysis and forecast as well on raw materials to other battery technologies. And our newer focus as well, we're expanding a bit. We're looking a bit more into vanadium flow from the end use point of view. And we're looking at solid-state batteries as well. So we've been around for 4 years, and our data now is used across the supply chain, from negotiating price contracts to battery companies negotiating their contracts with OEMs.
By show of hands, who here has read my book or come across my book, My Electrician Drives a Porsche? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. It's really hard to have a 5-hour dinner with everyone here. So when you read my book, it's effectively like sitting down and going A, B, C, all the way to Z on this energy pivot, on what I think is one of the most interesting opportunities that anyone in this room can have. Is there a pivot taking place? The answer is yes. The question everyone is asking, is this the beginning to the end of the oil age? And as I tell people, that's a really easy prescription to write, but a much harder one to take. The answer is yes, but it's going to take some time. Within this pivot, we need to look at the world's largest energy market and what they're doing, because that is what's going to echo around the world. I speak of China, and this is the country that I follow very carefully. So my book also talks about that. So I think we're going to have about 35 minutes on some various vignettes.
Yeah.
And hopefully give you some very current information. Simon also, I know, his group are leading edge with respect to batteries, which is now a cool thing, and it's all the people working within the battery sphere, because it's the way the chemistry is going to change, when it changes, if it changes, that's going to impact your pocketbook. So you want to gravitate to the winners and stay away from the losers. That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, let's just start on that. Like, that's a great point to start, is this potential pivot in the industry. So maybe you could answer, Gianni, I'll start with you and answer that question. Where are we? Are we at the beginning, the middle, near the end?
I follow energy very carefully, and the biggest meeting in the world of all people in energy, oil, gas, transfer, infrastructure, electricity, renewables, is in Houston, Texas. It takes place in the first week of March, when the who's who is there. It's organized by Daniel Yergin, and I saw 48 different plenaries. And these are all smart people, and they all have a little bit of a different agenda. But if you can get nuances if you glean information from these executives. And I got 4 different parables I'll tell. I'll tell the first one. Bob Dudley, who runs BP, and he said that we're looking for emissions. That's the problem. Going away from cars, going into electric cars. And he said that if every single car was electric, the problem is the emissions associated with the electricity generation, you have not solved the problem. And we were aghast. Shame on you, Bob Dudley. What you're telling us, you have a hyper adoption scenario to the electric car, and you assume that the way we generate the electricity shall stay static. This is absurd. I say, Bob Dudley, why don't you go to China, talk to Mr. Xu Yinbiao, who runs China State Grid, who has 1 billion customers, and ask him what he's doing. Because that's not the way they're thinking about it. And so I think if we look at what this leadership is telling people, and they're quoted in the media, they will bend the statistics. And Milton Friedman used to say this, the economist from Chicago. He says there are statistics and there are statistics. And if you know both sides of it, you can present the story in a very different way. So be very careful. So what I like to do when I tell people about statistics, how did we get to here? What are the clues? And that will help you, it'll guide your investment decisions, I hope and I think.
Let's segue to you, Simon. When we talk about this electrification, the big focus is on cars, really, right? And everybody's wondering how fast this is happening, so it relates to what you're saying, Gianni. Tesla, to put it into a bit of perspective, Tesla sold, 76,000 cars in 2017, somewhere in there?
Over 100 now.
Over 100 now. But in that year, the automobile also sold 15.5 million worldwide. So it's really small, but it's gaining momentum. Where do you see it unfolding? Where do you see this? We're obviously getting all the other car manufacturers out of there, all the choices. From your experience.
That's a good question, because it's not. It was about electric vehicles 2-3 years ago, and people are quite familiar with the Tesla Model S, with Nissan Leaf, and they're kind of mainstay cars now that we're used to. The Model 3 is the newest one, and these are passenger vehicles. So that, I would say, that era has arrived. The era of the semi-mass market electric vehicle, these pure EVs that are 100% battery powered, that has arrived. What is yet to arrive is the era of trucks, the era of commercial electric vehicles, electric buses outside of China. Now, the one critical point to remember is that these electric buses, or an electric bus, for example, is 6 to 8 times the size of a Tesla Model S. So no one's really considered buses, trucks, and other forms of transport going electric in their demand forecast, not in a serious way. They might say, yeah, we've got it in there in the other sector, in that other portion, but the reality is electrification is happening on a much wider scale. And we start to see that, when we look at where the batteries are actually going, when we speak to these battery companies in Japan, in China, in Korea, where they're selling to, it's really important to know that it's not just EVs. And it is happening, and it's starting to come outside of Europe.
So the narrative is going beyond cars, beyond Tesla, spreading into many other forms of transportation. I'm going to ask you, Chris, then, with all this battery transportation out there and applications, the battery is a store of power. So where's the power actually going to come from?
Well, the power inevitably will come from solar, it will come from wind, it will come from not coal, it will end up in a battery somewhere, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. If you're looking at the batteries that are required for electric vehicles, the lithium-ion batteries are very different from the batteries that are useful for the grid. In Australia right now, which I'm looking at as a bit of a bellwether for what I think will happen in Canada, Vanadium is like cannabis companies down there. If you have a Vanadium deal, you're shooting for the moon. And the reason for that is that Elon Musk built the world's largest grid battery in South Australia because they were having brownouts whenever the sun shined too hard and all the air conditioners came on. The vanadium battery that they're using, lithium-ion battery that they're using only has enough power in it for a couple of hours for the grid to recover. Vanadium redox batteries are much larger. You wouldn't put them in a car. They'd be too heavy, too slushy. But those things, you can build them in a nice big football field, and you could have as many wind turbines as you wanted, gather as much power as you could while the wind was going, and still have power left when it isn't. To me, that's the much more interesting play than how many grams of lithium can I get in a Tesla, which has a lot more graphite and a lot more nickel and a lot more aluminum in it than it ever does lithium. Lithium was the flavor of the month, and everyone understands that lithium-ion battery has lithium in it, but there's a lot of other things too that people are not paying that much attention to outside of maybe cobalt.
Right. Just one side question for you, Simon. Why is it then that, you know Elon Musk personally, why is it that he is using lithium-ion as a solution for the grid rather than the vanadium? Is it just because that's what he's fully vested into, or?
It's availability, cost is the biggest thing at the moment. I think with lithium-ion versus vanadium flow, it's not a secret that vanadium flow is better suited to energy storage on the grid. It's better as a battery. It's got a much longer lifespan than lithium-ion. But the reality is, for utility companies right now making a decision, they want to make a decision for, say, 3 months' time. And they want that to last, say, 10 years. And lithium-ion batteries are cheap enough, they're abundant enough, and they're good quality enough for the application, for that application today. The reality with vanadium flow is, whilst it is better than lithium-ion in this sector, it's still waiting that lithium-ion moment. It still needs an Elon Musk. It still needs that final marketing push, that more companies doing this, more options for the end user. And that's the only thing it lacks. If it has that, then the opportunities for vanadium companies in the supply chain are huge. The opportunities will mirror what's happened in lithium because, as Chris was saying, the energy storage space, it doesn't take much. These aren't end users. These aren't you guys buying an individual car. This is one company buying the equivalent of 100 times that in one deal. And so the point we try to make about energy storage, and I think this is a really important point, with the Tesla installation in Australia, which is 129 megawatt hours. You had the Aliso Canyon installation in California last year. That is over 300 megawatt hours. The Aliso Canyon one was installed in 8 months. There was a gas leak, a gas explosion in California. They had to react quickly with support for the grid. That was installed, that 300 megawatt hours was installed in 8 months. The Tesla one at 129 was installed in 3 months. And then now Elon Musk is trying to do a 1 gigawatt hour installation lithium ion. The takeaway point to make is that utility installations, utility battery installations are being installed, they're getting bigger, number one, and they're being installed quicker. That's the second point. And so really we're just at the start of this kind of movement.
Gianni, all this talk sounds very, very bullish here about lithium and cobalt and all the rest of it. I believe it was Morgan Stanley just a few months ago comes out and says, it's going to be a big lithium supply glut probably later this year. You have comments on that?
Well, it's another prognostication, and those are very dangerous, And is there lots of lithium in the world? Yeah, there is. Have there been a lot of money spent into the exploration and development of lithium projects around the world? Yeah, there has. Will some of those projects come online in the next 2, 3, 4 years? Yeah, they will. Look to the other commodities. The answer is already there. So you look at the relative valuation. If a share has went from 10 cents to $2 or 20 cents to $2, and you're in the business of wanting to make 10%, so if you want to buy a $2 share and make 10% to go to $2.20, yeah, maybe, that's a good opportunity. Let me take you a different way. Let me take you on an interesting journey that I just took. The world's largest collection of data for copper is the International Copper Study Group, based in Lisbon. So the number's about 89% of all the statistics for copper report into this bureau. And they invited me to come give the keynote, April 26th, in Lisbon, Copper's Role in the Future of Energy, which, of course, people have seen my talks, and I'm really good at telling a story, and I'm optimistic. But they look at the stats. They don't care about my prognostic or my propaganda. And what they're telling the world is that this is the last year. We get one big copper mine this year, which is Cobre Panama. There's nothing new coming, folks. Not in 19, not in 20, not in 21. You got to wait till 2022 when the expansion of Oyu Tolgoi and potentially Robert Friedland's Kamoa, there's nothing coming. Now let's look at the valuations. You go pick any 5 or 6 or 7 of your favorite copper companies, juniors, they're not trading at $2 a share. They're trading at 5 or 10 cents a share. So if you look at the value proposition on the MPV calculations of what these projects could put out, the optionality is tremendous. So you need to start pivoting into copper. Okay, my friend Frank Holmes has been telling people this for 3 or 4 months. People still have their hands in their pockets, but we know junior mining. Everyone here knows it. The share that's 10 cents doesn't go to 11 cents and trade sideways. It gaps up to 25, and you think you missed the bus, and you refuse to buy the shares. Oh, it's going to come down. No, it doesn't come down. And you feel like you missed it. And then it goes to 40 cents, and then 50 cents. Lithium stocks 4 years ago were trading at 10 and 15 and 20 cents. Okay? That's the opportunity, and it's abundantly clear for myself that as we electrify, and everyone's talking about electrification, that meeting at CERAWeek where all the people are together, the word copper was not mentioned, does not get a line item. This is an underappreciated reality that when that supply-demand differential actually manifests itself, which is already on our doorstep, it becomes a front-page story. And you know what they say, never invest in the story on page 1. That's the efficient market. Invest in the story on page 16. That will one day be on page 1. So
yeah, copper is really interesting. Whether you're producing energy, transmitting energy, or storing it in a battery,
wins the marathon each
there's
time.
copper all the way through. Maybe Simon, just a quick comment: how much copper is in a lithium-ion battery?
Gianni, how much copper is in a lithium-ion battery?
Well, that's another interesting story.
A lot more.
I drove a Tesla across America, and I spoke with people, energy people, typically incumbent energy people, to talk about the future is now. And I'm in the middle of America. I was in Texas. That was a lot of fun, talking with those guys. I was challenged when I came into Dallas to park at a specific hotel because they didn't have a Tesla charger. And the guy says, haha, what you going to do now? And I said, well, I'll probably park in the front door and plug it in the wall and fall asleep, and I get 4 miles every hour it's charged. The second part of it is I drove north to Oklahoma, and I met with Dirk Spears, the battery king of America. And they do all the service work for batteries. Nissan Leaf, for Honda, for Toyota, all these guys. And there was a Nissan Leaf battery pack on the table, and he's got one of his science geeks wearing a smock. I said, you want to do me a favor? Take this thing apart for me. And he took out an individual cell, and I said, oh, let's go farther. Let's open it right up. I take it apart. And we go and we peel back all the layers, anode, cathode, anode, cathode, anode, cathode. And on the anode, I said, what's that? Scrape it away. Oh, it's copper. And I said, of this battery, what's the heaviest component of this particular thing? He goes, probably the copper, about 30% of the weight in there. 30% of the weight was copper. They never talk about that. You take one of the lithium-ion cells of a Tesla, it's rolled, they're not plates, but cut it in half. It's a sandwich with all these interesting layers. And the most dominant color you're going to see is, guess what? Copper. Copper. Of course, all the interconnectivity and everything else in the battery is also there, right? So it's, once again, it's about 25-30%.
Chris, why don't we bring it back to you for a minute? From your perspective and your writing, what are you seeing out there for your audience that they should really be focusing on in the battery metal space?
Well, I'll give Gianni some credit. I've been hearing him speak about this for 2 years now, and in that 2 years, copper prices have come up about 80%. So you talk about prognostications not always having any merit to them. Well, he's got 2 years of track record of telling everybody buy copper and copper actually coming up. But if you look at the supply side of copper as well, as it's gone up in price, the supply end is coming down and down and down. Like you look at the LMEs, and it's a ski slope. It just goes. So I think it's going to be an interesting point. But you also can roll that along to nickel. You could roll it along to silver. You need gold in a lot of the applications for this. You need zinc. You need cobalt and manganese and vanadium. So really, if you look out there on the floor and tell me how many manganese companies you see and how many vanadiums, I think there's one cobalt company. There's a lot of gold companies just doing the same thing we've been doing for the last 20, 30 years, hoping that we find the mother lode and all get rich. But there's no one who's actually going out there and working towards the future that we all see lying in front of us. Other than when there's a market shift. If lithium suddenly goes up in price, then every grifter in town suddenly has a lithium shell. But how many lithium companies are still out there of the 150 that would have been at this show 2 years ago? So really, what you're looking at is either you're going to invest in the market move, which is easy, and might make you a few percentage points and might lose if you're the last one out the door, or you invest in the macro trends. And the macro trends are, if you've got anything in your pocket right now, it has a lithium-ion battery in it, I guarantee it. If you've got a laptop with you, if there's a smoke alarm above me, it has a lithium-ion battery. So what we're looking at is every part of what we do is going to require mining and processing and someone to create better technology. There's a company out here, Nano One Materials, which isn't a mining company, but it's a technology company. It's working on putting together better processes of building better batteries. That thing has returned me 4 times my investment in the last year and a half, and they haven't got started yet. Like, there's a lot of companies out there that are doing really, really interesting things that don't involve taping off a cow paddock and sticking a drill in the ground and saying in 6 years we'll have something.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, Simon and Benchmark Minerals Intelligence is one of the main sponsors here. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, 10:30?
10:30.
They'll be dedicating a whole day of speakers specifically on the lithium-ion supply chain. So you should really take that in. It's tomorrow. So I don't want to take too much away, but I do want to get a comment from you now, because you mentioned all these other elements about battery chemistries, because we get hot and heavy. We see cobalt going up in price. It's coming out of unscrupulous countries. It's coming out of these AK-47 countries, as they say. But so then you have Elon Musk come out 2 weeks ago and say, well, we're gonna engineer right out of cobalt eventually. And there's probably about 10 different chemistries out there, and everybody's talking about them. But just give us some background there.
Yeah, so fundamentally, the whole goal, what Elon Musk said in his Q2, I think, call was, apart from telling analysts they're boneheads and not listening to their questions, he actually, the more important thing he said was that they're reducing the cobalt in a battery. That he actually said their goal is to engineer it right out of a lithium-ion battery. The reality is that will never happen, right? Cobalt out of a lithium-ion battery will never happen. You need cobalt in there for a safety reason, as a stabilizer. The key thing to understand is the battery industry are trying to increase the nickel and decrease the cobalt, but you're always going to need the cobalt. So the second part to understand is that they're very far away from this, from truly commercializing this holy grail called a 811 chemistry. It's 80% nickel, 10% cobalt, 10% manganese. So they're quite far away from that, despite what people think. The reality is there aren't really any commercial batteries out there yet that use that chemistry. Now, there are batteries that use, most batteries, or a lot of them, are this 111 chemistry, which uses a lot of cobalt. But really where we are commercially is a 523, 50% nickel, and a 622, 60% nickel, and the rest is the ratio. So that's the trend in the industry. You'll never engineer cobalt out. And the reality is, if you look at the demand path for batteries, even conservatively, even if you half even the middle forecast out there for EVs, for energy storage, cobalt's got a big problem. Cobalt has got a big problem. You're not going to be able to have an electric vehicle industry without DRC cobalt, yet all the end users want guaranteed conflict-free cobalt. Well, you can't have it guaranteed unless you're buying from outside the DRC. And the reality is, if you look at the producers outside of DRC, they're very small, very fragmented. And the cobalt industry, despite this cobalt content dropping in the battery, it's got a big problem for 10 years, a big supply problem.
So I guess one of the takeaways here is that the lithium-ion battery is here for a good long run, and that cobalt's a critical component for at least the next 10 years or so.
Questions? Sorry? Will there be questions?
Yeah, do you want to jump into that now? Okay, so what we're going to do, because we are running short on time and I gotta run here pretty quick, is I'd like to open it up to some questions to the audience.
Fire safety.
The question is, what can you tell me about fire safety in a battery? That must have come from that picture on the internet the other day of a Tesla catching fire, perhaps.
Yeah, I can give it. Do you want to give it a crack? Do you want to give it a crack?
I'll just say that I get more personal satisfaction out of the tens of thousands of internal combustion engine cars that explode on freeways around America every year than I do the one electric car that catches on fire. But anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. But it is an issue, right? It is because they're new technology. Well, it's not new technology, but the cars and the packs are new. Fire safety, batteries exploding is an issue for people. The reality is, it's very rare. But the problem is when you're packing, these batteries are not really changing size that much. They're getting more energy dense. So you're packing more energy into a smaller space. So when you do that, the risk of fire hazards go up. Another reason why you need cobalt. The second thing is when the batteries get pierced, they don't really explode like the combustion engine. They'll kind of burn intensely for about 7 days. So that's another hazard as well. It's so few and far between with lithium-ion batteries. We've been using them for 20 years. I don't see it as it's not a mainstream risk, but this is where pack engineering comes in. This is where Tesla and other companies, it's where they earn their crust, if you like, and to make sure that they reduce that number to zero, which will be impossible.
The delights of the internet, right? One car blows up and it turns into a major issue.
I was going to say, there's one of the issues that relates to that is source material, right? So if you're getting your cobalt from the DRC and you're sending kids down on ropes with sticks to poke things off a wall and stick it in a bag and wash it in the river and then send it to China to use in Samsung cell phones, chances are that your grade isn't going to be very reliable. And so the things that we've had with cell phones overheating and that sort of thing that cause problems with Samsung, it really comes back to an industry that doesn't have the standards in place yet that it would if, say, the Cobalt Ontario camp was another couple of years progressed. Yeah. So once we have cobalt that's from a steady supply, that's got a reliable backstory and doesn't involve hanging children, fire safety will be less of an issue.
The question is the MIT study that puts more tin into the battery, correct?
Tin anodes? Do you know much about tin anodes? Probably.
I only know that tin was a very common mining in England about 100 years ago. But
cheers. Just quickly on tin. I mean, the only thing I know about tin in batteries is tin anodes. In lithium-ion, well, not in lithium-ion batteries, in different technologies. The reality is, commercially, that's not even been looked at. I mean, MIT or other institutions might be looking at lots of different ways to make batteries to balance weight with energy density, and this is one of the ways of doing it. But commercially, non-existent at the moment.
And I think this is something Gianni talked on. Like you can't get too caught up into these, these announcements here and there that are extremely experimental, right?
Yeah.
They're not coming next year, right?
True, and I'll enlighten you guys as well. Simon and I are going to Portland, Oregon on Friday to look at a giant iron sulfur battery. Iron sulfur. Now, is there tin coated on certain things? I'm really curious about looking at this company. It's already commercially viable. It's got lots of investment backing. They come in containers. Now, really, what else is in there but the iron and the sulfur? That's why I'm there for the copper perspective, because the conductors that connect this thing are thicker than your arm. So,
do we have another question here?
Should be ready now. Try it.
Just wonder if you had any preference between brine, lithium, and hard rock, apart from the costs of the two?
Hard rock versus brine.
It really depends on the market cap of the company you're talking to. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Hard rock, it's once you spot it, there's a lot of it. It's easy to get to, but you've got to send it out and process. It's more expensive. Brine, you've got to have the big old planars of multicolored lakes drying in the sun over many years. They're both applicable. I wanted to just quickly bounce back to the previous question a little bit. There are better technologies in lithium-ion batteries right now. There's always going to be new technologies come along that make things better and more efficient and cleaner and cheaper, and Nano One, as we mentioned, is working on that. That's not the difficulty. The difficulty is in, there are better ways to get people around than cars. But in order to make that happen, we have to stop producing cars, get that entire industry to stop and move to something different and change the ways they're going to do things. And that is a heavy cruise ship to turn in a tight channel. You'd have to have such a great technology to wipe out existing setups and infrastructures for lithium-ion that it would make everyone's head spin. And I don't see that happening in 10 years.
Yeah, bang on.
We've got what we've got for the foreseeable. And it might improve a little bit in terms of yield, but realistically, the sea change that everyone's looking for is, even if it comes, if someone walks in this room today and says, "I'm Jesus Christ," it's going to take a long time before he can prove that he actually is. These things work on a very, 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 very long way.
Yeah, multiple billions of dollars sunk in to get to where we are.
We had electric cars in the 70s, and we're only just buying them now, so that tells you something.
Yeah, so it's a tremendous effort to displace the incumbent, as it were. Question?
Change the subject on silver. California's announcement that by 2020, all the homes have to have solar panels. How about the silver crunch going forward?
No idea about silver.
Well, that's an interesting comment. Now, the old way they used to do it is you would put a roof on a house, and then you would put a panel on the roof. That's going to go away. It's going to be what a company based in Northern California, named after a famous Serbo-Croatian scientist, what they're doing is basically saying, why don't we just make a roof that's going to last between 50 and 100 years, and it is the solar panel. That company, the cars they make is a red herring. They're an integrated energy solution company, and they disintermediate so many things. Now, my talk is on in the next 2 minutes. I'll get into some statistics on that. But yeah, it's not just California. It's going to happen around the world. And as the cost of these things go down, the day will arrive where it's actually cheaper to do it that way than to put the roof and then the solar panel. It will be nonsensical. By the way, your windows will also be solar panels.
Yeah.
Curtailment won't be an issue. You just turn it off.